All right, Proposition 4.
My name is Helen Kirstein with the Legislative Analyst's Office. So Proposition 4 authorizes the state to sell $10 billion of bonds for various natural resources and climate-related activities. So those activities fit within 8 broad categories. I'm going to try to go through them pretty quickly because there are a number of them. The biggest category that would be funded by this bond is $3.8 billion, which would go to various drought, flood, and water supply activities. Then the next biggest allocation is for forest health and wildfire prevention activities. That's $1.5 billion. Then there would be $1.2 billion each for sea level rise in coastal areas and for land conservation and habitat restoration. Next, there's $850 million that would go towards energy infrastructure, $700 million that would go towards parks, $450 million that would go to extreme heat-related activities, and $300 million that would go to farms and agriculture. So notably, even though there are these 8 broad subcategories, there are roughly 100 specific allocations and subcategories really for how the amounts would be spent in the bond. So in some cases, the bond allocates money to specific areas of the state or specific programs within those broad activities. Much of the funding that would be provided by Proposition 4 would likely go out as grants, and a lot of that would go to local agencies, nonprofits, tribes, and in some cases, private entities as well. Some of the funding, though, would be set aside for state agencies to administer projects themselves. So in terms of the main fiscal effects, we think the biggest fiscal effect for the state would be repaying the bonds, which are borrowing the state would incur. We estimate the cost to taxpayers to repay the bond would be about $400 million per year over a 40-year period. Those repayments would come from the state's general fund, which is the state's main operating account. With regard to local governments, there are probably a variety of different fiscal effects, but we think that, on net, there would likely be savings to local governments. This is because we think that there's a high likelihood that local governments would receive funding for some activities that they would probably already do, although maybe potentially on a different timeline absent this funding. So for example, some funding could go towards drinking water projects that local governments might already undertake to meet compliance obligations. So we think the level of savings is somewhat uncertain in this area, but we do think it could average in the tens of millions of dollars per year for a few decades. The other fiscal effect that I just wanted to mention is that to the extent that the funding in this bond was successful at reducing the risks of disasters, and in some cases, for example, there's funding for some flood control projects and wildfire mitigation projects. So if those projects were successful at reducing those disasters, then there could be some savings to state and local governments associated with responding or rebuilding from those disasters. But we think that the amount of savings is pretty uncertain there, so we weren't able to quantify it.
Thank you. So one of the things I think that is important for understanding this one is that the legislature had originally allocated about an additional $10 billion to similar sorts of projects, but they cut back because of the condition of the budget this year. So in some ways, this is an attempt to backfill that money. It's put on the ballot by the legislature. In support, we have the National Wildlife Federation, professional firefighters, Clean Water Action, labor, teachers, the California League of Women Voters, the Democratic Party, Water Districts Municipal Utility Association, against Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association, again, because we didn't incur costs as taxpayers. The Republican Party of California is against it, and then several legislative leaders who are Republicans. Newspapers are split. The Sacramento Bee, San Francisco Chronicle, and the LA Times are in favor. And then in opposition, we have the Southern California News Group, which is a group of a bunch of smaller California local publications, and then the East Bay Times and San Diego Union Tribune. And then in support, we have Save the Redwoods League, State Parks, another Redwood organization, so it's, sort of green organizations, also contractors, and park foundations, and then there's no money in opposition to this measure. So it's completely lopsided. What questions do you have about Prop 4? We have a roving mic. Good.
Hi. I was just wondering if there's anything in the text of the...
Could you hold the mic a little closer? Thank you.
Is this better? anything in the text of the bill that would prevent the energy infrastructure funding from going to fossil fuel infrastructure?
Yeah, so there are some specific, it's not really related to fossil fuel activities. So the money for the energy piece would go towards transmission financing, battery storage, and improvements at ports that are intended to support the development of offshore wind. So at least my understanding is they're not really aimed at the fossil fuel side. Although I suppose electric transmission, you could use that perhaps for to support a variety of different types of energy generation, activities. But there's nothing, as I see it, that's sort of directed at that.
Great. Another question over here?
Sure. I'm just wondering about the context. How much of an increase to the budget would this be? Like, how much are we already giving out in grant money for these projects?
Yeah, and it partly depends on which category. But for example, I think in our recent budgets, we had a pretty robust general fund for a few years, and we allocated over $30 billion towards various climate activities on a one-time basis spread over a few years. And this would, then we did reduce some of that, but still kept over $30 billion. So that kind of gives you a little bit of context there. But I don't have right in front of me the total amount, and it sort of depends. I think I have it, well, I should have it. I guess I do have it sort of here. It depends on the year, but I think it's been kind of in the range of between, it looks like, I don't know, maybe around 10, 15 billion, it depends on the year, and from a variety of different sources for kind of climate and resources.
Thank you.
And another question?
Yeah, I was wondering if the LAO had spent any time with the impact that these funds that go towards kind of climate crisis response would have on the insurance industry, and whether or not it will help to keep insurers in the state and reduce rate for ratepayers.
So we haven't done a specific analysis of how this bond would affect the insurance industry. I guess one thing I would note is I think the main place where this could relate to the insurance industry is in the wildfire space. That's been an area where insurers have had a number of concerns, and we've seen some pullbacks in insurers being willing to cover high-risk properties. So that is a significant allocation in total, $1.5 billion. And some of that is sort of more directly related to kind of home hardening and defensible space, and some of it's sort of broader. But I think there are also other funding sources that the state is allocating in this space, and probably the sort of amount of, to treat all of the acres across the state, for example, or to harden all of the homes, certainly would not be feasible within this total amount. So this potentially could provide some assistance, certainly in that area, but it's unlikely to sort of, I think, it's not enough that we'd be able to eliminate the issue of insurance, I think, in the state. I think that's still probably going to be a continuing issue, just given the magnitude of that challenge.
Thank you.